I recently caught notice of a video from a YouTuber named Kothorix on a controversy involving a furry artist named Rowf. Well, pretty much everything he said on the controversy itself regarding just the facts seemed completely fine, to my knowledge. The judgments of value that he seemed to make were something I took contention with. I'll try to address this the best I can. Later on in the video I will use one source to help me explain my thesis. First, we must make sure we understand our reference before I expand on why I disagree with Kothorix's judgments of value. Our point of reference will be primarily the Rowf CP controversy video, but also a video linked in the description of the primary video as a supplement. Art is art. Kothorix begins the video by establishing that the artist Rowf has been made the object of a CP controversy. To be curt, the images that are being interpreted as CP are professionally taken child model photographs among legal porn, as elaborated here.
Now where the whole child pornography allegations are coming from is when Rowf posts several pictures of young girls around age 10 to 12 in bathing suits. Through reading the conversation, it's easy to discern that the purpose of this is to use them as references for the character's body type. These photos were taken from Google Images, and most of them look like they were professionally shot, likely for a fashion or modeling magazine or a catalog that sells clothes. Later in the conversation, there are some pornographic images, but they are of adults, namely of porn actress Sammy Daniels, who does look very young, so it's easy to see why there could be some confusion.
The inclusion of value judgment starts from about here. Kothorix describes the conversation held between Rowf and a commissioner of his.
It's clear that they are talking about a furry character, not a real person. This sort of pornographic art and conversation of young furry characters, also colloquially known as cub art, is looked down on by the majority of the furry community. Some people would even go as far as to say that liking this sort of art makes you a pedophile, with the implication that you would molest actual kids if given the chance. I have to disagree with that. I would say that fantasy and drawings and roleplay shouldn't be confused with real-life intentions.
The term intentions ought to be stressed. Intentions are the thing as they're described by real life, the thing which must underline some mode of action, as intent must be on the outset of action, and in this case within the domain real life. Following the fantasy-reality dichotomy then, as it's claimed that these fantasies and drawings of fetish are separate from reality as they are not confused. If intention is the thing of the expression which belongs to a domain, then it must also exist within fantasy belonging there. As is elaborated here by Kothorix, he states that a given kink, which may be bizarre and fantastical, may not necessarily be played out in real life by the subject to whom the kink belongs. To make my argument a bit more clear, I will focus on vor and make an example of it as I work through my argument, and address pedophilia later. Fantastical kinks are suggested that they may not be played out in real life. There is an insufficient physical capacity to perform them, amongst the fact that, as my current analysis suggests, truly fantastical fetishes have their own intentions behind them or are constituted by something which makes them separate from reality. Anyway, Kothorix makes an example of his vor fetish here.
I don't feel it's fair to call them the same thing. After all, we all have our own kinks, some of which are plenty bizarre and fantastical, but we would never try to enact them in real life. For example, one of mine is vor.
However, he brings up cannibalism, which he does possess the physical means to perform. However, he says that he would not necessarily perform this in real life, not despite his fetish, but rather because his fetish belongs to the realm of fantasy. It's a fantastical fetish, it belongs to or is of that realm, is what I interpret. If this is true, then Kothorix is right, though I don't think this is true. Let's presume that the fetish isn't belonging to or constitute from fantasy, but from a desire or drive. If the desire has sufficient properties or a particular nature, and operates outside these realms of fantasy and reality, it may not be restricted from reality. Let's investigate this. If desire underlines the fetishism, and sufficiency for cannibalism is true by nature of the desire, then what stops this behavior from being enacted? Either by means of ethical restraint or a lack of connection between the kink possessed and the potential activity. In this case, cannibalism. To simplify, the ethical restraint would be the motivation not to do, whereas the lack of connection would be a lack of motivation to do. This lack of connection would be constituted by the drive, or the desire, missing certain properties to connect to a fetish. What I mean is, certain drives might make it possible for one to have two similar fetishes as a result of a drive, whereas others might prevent one from having these two similar fetishes at once. For example, desire might dictate to one's fetish that the object of the vor must not experience pain and must remain alive. Thus, in this case, cannibalism cannot be linked to vor if the drive for one's vor fetish dictates this. And this also brings us to another degree of elaboration. If the drive was more so based in the causing of pain rather toward the consumption of something, knowingly and wantingly bringing it to a grim end, then that would be a pure contrast, there would be a connection. Of course, there could be other variations which constitute the drive, and therefore various fetish connections. At the latter end of his example, he says this:
Obviously, I'm not going to try to eat anyone in real life. I'd find it incredibly silly if people were accusing me of being a murderer or cannibal because I like a certain kind of drawn art on the internet.
Of course, it would be silly to accuse someone outright of being a cannibal because they have a vor fetish, though I feel this aggression of absurd accusation, in effect, attempts to reduce more reasonable accusations to the same absurdity. Though, let's press on. Earlier, I referenced the use of bizarre and fantastical, as Kothorix uses it to describe certain fetishes. Given that each kink in question has been one that has a varying negative moral implication, pedophilia and vor, we presume that bizarre and fantastical describes these kinds of kinks. Of course, a fantastical fetish could be something morally benign, but the inclusion of that fact into the argument would be irrelevant, as the argument is attempting to address, at its core, immoral behavior. Though Kothorix doesn't imply this distinction between bizarre and fantastical, he lumps them, I think it's useful to employ here. What is bizarre, then, could be something like pedophilia, perfectly actionable with lesser degree of adjustment to reality when performed. What is fantastical, then, cannot be actioned without a great degree of adjustment, or perhaps even actioned at all in any direct sense. Though, what if we presumed that a fantastical fetish can't even be actioned indirectly? Can it just be comfortable within a fantasy? Would energy spent there suffice to relieve the drive responsible for the fetish? In my mind, I keep coming back to something Kothorix said earlier.
This sort of pornographic art and conversation of young furry characters, also colloquially known as cub art, is looked down on by the majority of the furry community. Some people would even go as far as to say that liking this sort of art makes you a pedophile, with the implication that you would molest actual kids if given the chance. I have to disagree with that.
How do you know there's no sufficiency for that in some given instance? I guess if I have characterized the benign sexuality argument for Kothorix correctly, then there can't ever be sufficiency. It's just a fantasy, after all. But what about those bizarre fetishes? Those fetishes which are readily compatible with reality? Considering what we've said, immoral fetishes belonging to this category would be more dangerous. The bridge toward reality for them is clearly set and doesn't require haphazard construction. That bridge doesn't really have that much of a chance of collapsing either. This is quite a worrying thing, and also my major point of concern. Kothorix, who, to my dismay, keeps referring to the fetish material in question as just a certain kind of artwork that he likes. The effect of this is nullifying, ignoring the underlying desire behind an interest in the subject matter of the artwork, as it's simply just art.
I think that most people are capable of separating fantasy from reality.
To an important extent, I disagree with the use of this. Not because of a general incapacity to make distinct these two realms, but because the base of fetish itself exists in neither domain. Fantasy and reality, as I'm trying to suggest, are just playgrounds for these fetishes and their drives to discharge themselves. It's not that the fantasy itself is the fetish or is the fetish's constitution. If it were, where is its foundation? Why does this fantasy exist? What is its drive? And, psychoanalytically speaking, drive is fundamental. The danger of thinking about things in this way is that you presume that the fetish is isolated in a space where it can be actioned safely, within fantasy, with nothing to impose upon the real. Rather, the fetish, and its leash-holder, its desire, actively tries to discharge itself wherever it may, even if it's just minute sublimation. That serves as evidence enough that this issue of fetish and desire isn't something to conceptualize as something in an arbitrary box locked away from the world. And to describe my evidence, and what I mean by psychoanalytically speaking, I will use my citation, Freud and Nietzsche on Sublimation. Ken Gems lays out the difficulties psychoanalysts, amongst others, have had in understanding the exact nature of sublimation. Regardless of which position on sublimation's exact nature is most accurate, each position is addressing the same general phenomenon. Gems first defines it from the Freudian position. Sublimation involves the redirecting of a repressed sexual drive toward a non-sexual aim, though I tend to disagree with this definition insofar that sublimation does not necessarily have to proceed from a sexual drive, The definitions used for us here is functional. Two cases then are introduced, the case of Leonardo da Vinci and the case of Schreber, both who possessed repressed homosexuality, which in each case was the drive. In Leonardo's case, his homosexual drive was sublimated into an enthusiasm for art and science, whereas Schreber's homosexuality was neuroticized into a fixation onto God in a negative sense. The term neuroticized is used in the latter case instead of sublimation, as Freud uses social valuation to make distinct sublimation from neurotic symptom, though the use of social valuation in order to define the nature of sublimation is done away with in interpretations of the term by Finichel and Nietzsche. Of course, one could say that identifying behaviors as a product of a drive being sublimated or neuroticized is an ad hoc performance. Leonardo being enthused over the arts and sciences, even obsessively, is his homosexuality the root cause? Of course, the way in which his endeavor into the arts and sciences was performed, especially his aim to ideally capture the male figure, and also, I quote, his fondness for beautiful disciples of questionable artistic talent in whom he took a very protective interest, should be considered. I could then question whether or not the expression of sucking on a pacifier or thumb is related to a desire to breastfeed, whether that desire is sexual or non-sexual. Basically, the more closely related the activity is to the root of the pathology or character quality, the easier it is to identify a subliminal or fetish drive relationship. I cite all of this for two purposes. The first is that the mere mention of sublimation reduces the claim that fetish is constituted by or withheld to the realm of fantasy to a falsehood. Second, that in defining sublimation I'm attempting to complete a summarized structure of how I conceive fetish or kink. And the summary is thus: that drive necessarily underlies all fetish, and that if drive is sublimated, neuroticized, or repressed, then the need to action fetish is minimized at least. If redirection cannot occur, then the fetish must be actioned either directly or indirectly. Mental energy can't just go nowhere. This is prima facie true. Right now I'm going to go ahead and address the rest of the video, but I will come back and reaffirm my thesis.
If no one is being hurt and it isn't illegal, I don't see a problem with it.
To this argument, I'd say firstly that using illegality as a criteria for what is acceptable somewhat undermines the supplement video Art is Art, which claims that law prohibiting the depiction of morally unacceptable fetishes is unfair. I guess it's not necessarily the case. You could have a problem with the law, but at the end of the day, the law is the law.
And certainly just creating drawings isn't hurting anyone.
The argument I find for the prohibition of content depicting immoral fetishes is that the propagation or encouragement of desire for said immoral fetishes should be minimized, hence the prohibition. I don't really agree with the prohibition of this content either, but my reasoning for this differs from Kothorix's.
But even if the art, the conversations, or using these pictures isn't directly hurting anyone, some would argue that it's still exploiting these kids in some way.
Kothorix says he somewhat agrees with this, but he displaces the blame from Zausch and onto the people responsible for producing the photographs. I feel this argument is actually counterintuitive, honestly. If the photographers and parents of these children are in the moral wrong for originally propagating these images, why isn't Zausch taking any blame for being complicit in the propagation of said images by using them and actually propagating them himself, even if on a much more minute scale and unoriginally? Kothorix goes on to question whether the use of animal reference for furry art is animal exploitation. For the sake of time, I'll just say that my biggest issue here is that animals aren't human children. To close, I have my own fetishes, or kinks, or whatever you would like to call them, and in no way is this video about kink shaming, but trying to understand the reality of fetish, even if that reality is unpleasant to me. Of course, many of the things which I posited here may not be true. My ideas are open for development or negation, and that's good. I encourage that. Again, my main concern lies with a need for introspection rather than taking things as true without much investigation as to why those things are taken as such. I don't think the narrative that fetishes are benign and are separate from reality is a helpful nor careful one. Also, if you watch this, Kothorix, I don't mean this video as a polemic or as a means to indignify you. I thought your video was very well presented, and that a reminder for people to be accountable for themselves and what they know is something generally good, especially if someone will suffer from a group's misconception of what is true if this self-accountability isn't practiced. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you like what you saw, let me know. I really value your guys' thoughts and would like to know what you guys thought specifically if you'd like to share, whether it be praise or critique. Take care.